What if the people chosen to change the world were the least qualified? Not the educated, not the powerful, not the respected, but the overlooked, the impulsive, the flawed. It sounds almost unbelievable, yet that is exactly how one of the most influential movements in history began. At a time when society valued status, knowledge, and religious authority above all else, Jesus did something completely unexpected. He walked past the scholars, ignored the elite, and turned instead to ordinary men whose lives seemed far too simple to matter. This raises a question that has puzzled people for centuries. Why didn't Jesus choose religious leaders, the ones who studied the law, who understood tradition, who were seen as closest to God? If the goal was to spread a message that would change the world, wouldn't it make more sense to choose those already trained to teach and lead? And yet, he didn't. Instead, he chose fishermen who smelled of the sea, a tax collector who was despised by his own people, and others who carried no remarkable reputation at all. What did he see in them that everyone else missed? The mystery deepens when you look closer at these men. They weren't just ordinary. They were imperfect. Some were impulsive, speaking before thinking. Others were quiet, unsure, even doubtful. They had no influence, no wealth, no special position in society. And still, they were chosen. What made them special? Was it something within them, something hidden beneath their ordinary lives? Or was it something about the one who called them that made all the difference? And then there's the cost. When Jesus called them, he didn't offer comfort or security. He didn't promise wealth, status, or an easy path. Instead, he asked them to leave everything behind, their livelihoods, their families, their sense of certainty, and step into the unknown. Imagine standing at the edge of your entire life, knowing that one decision could change everything. Why would they say yes? What did they feel in that moment that was strong enough to pull them away from everything they had ever known? To understand this story, you have to step back into the world they lived in. It was a time of tension and expectation. The Roman Empire ruled with power and control, and the Jewish people longed for freedom. Many believed a Messiah would come, not as a teacher, but as a political leader, someone who would overthrow oppression and restore their nation. Society was divided, with strict religious systems and clear hierarchies that determined a person's worth. In a world like that, no one expected a revolution to begin with fishermen and outcasts. And yet, that is exactly where it began. Not in palaces or temples, but along dusty roads and quiet shores where ordinary lives were about to be interrupted in the most extraordinary way. The world Jesus stepped into was not calm or hopeful. It was tense, restless, and filled with quiet desperation. The Roman Empire ruled with an iron grip, stretching its power across vast lands, including Judea. Soldiers were a constant presence, a reminder that freedom was not just limited, it was gone. Taxes were heavy, often crushing families who struggled to survive, and any sign of rebellion was met with swift and brutal force. People lived carefully, watching what they said, knowing that even a small act of defiance could cost them everything. But the tension was not only political, it was deeply spiritual. For generations, the Jewish people had held on to ancient promises that one day a Messiah would come, a chosen one sent by God to restore their nation and bring justice. These promises weren't distant ideas. They were alive in everyday conversations, whispered in homes, debated in public spaces, and preached in synagogues. Everyone was waiting, but their expectations had taken a very specific shape. They imagined a powerful leader, someone strong, commanding, and unstoppable, who would rise like a king and overthrow Rome. Religious leaders held enormous influence in this world. Groups like the Pharisees and Sadducees were seen as authorities on the law of God. They studied it, taught taught it and enforced it. To the people, they represented order, knowledge, and a direct connection to the divine. But over time, something had shifted. The focus had moved from relationship to rules, from transformation to appearance. Religion had become something to perform rather than something to live. And while many followed these leaders faithfully, others felt burdened, even excluded, by a system that seemed to leave little room for imperfection. Society itself was sharply divided. There were clear lines between the respected and the rejected, the clean and the unclean, the powerful and the powerless. Fishermen worked long, exhausting hours just to get by, often unsure if their next catch would be enough to feed their families. Tax collectors were seen as traitors, working for Rome and often taking more than they should, making them some of the most hated people in the community. Zealots burned with anger, ready to fight for freedom at any moment, believing violence was the only path to justice. Each group lived in its own world, separated not just by occupation but by deep mistrust and judgment. In a time like this, people were searching for hope, but they were also cautious. Many had seen false messiahs before, men who claimed to bring change but only led to disappointment or destruction. Entire movements had risen and fallen, leaving behind fear and uncertainty. So when someone new appeared, speaking with authority and talking about the kingdom of God, people listened, but they also questioned. Could this really be the one they had been waiting for? Or was this just another voice that would fade away? What made Jesus different was not just what he said, but how he moved through this divided world. He didn't stay within the boundaries that society had carefully built. He spoke to those who were ignored, touched those considered unclean, and sat with those others refused to acknowledge. He challenged not just political ideas, but deeply rooted beliefs about who mattered and who didn't. Instead of reinforcing the system, he quietly began to turn it upside down. There was something else that made this moment unique. Beneath all the tension, there was a growing sense that change was coming. People were tired of oppression, tired of empty rituals, tired of waiting. Even those who held power could feel it. The world was ready for something different, even if no one fully understood what that would look like. This was the environment in which Jesus began to choose his disciples. A world full of expectation, tension, division, and longing. A world where power was respected, status was everything, and ordinary people were rarely seen as part of something greater. And yet, it was within this exact setting that Jesus started to build a group that would eventually change the course of history, not by force, not by status, but by something far more unexpected. And what he was about to do next would challenge everything people thought they knew about power, purpose, and who was truly worthy to be chosen. It would not begin in the halls of power or among the respected teachers of the law, but in the middle of ordinary routines, on boats, at workstations, in the flow of everyday life. The moment of calling would come without warning, interrupting normal life in a way that forced a decision. Stay where it is safe, or step into something completely unknown. And those who said yes would never be the same again. The shoreline was quiet, except for the steady rhythm of water brushing against the boats. Nets were being pulled in, heavy with the weight of a long night's work, though not always with the reward the fishermen hoped for. This was the life of Peter, Andrew, James, and John. Simple, repetitive, and demanding. They were not strangers to exhaustion. Every day was shaped by uncertainty. Some nights brought a full catch, enough to provide for their families. Other nights ended in disappointment, empty nets, and silent frustration. Peter was the kind of man who spoke quickly and acted even faster, strong, passionate, and often impulsive. He carried both confidence and contradiction within him. Andrew, his brother, was quieter, more reflective, the kind of person who noticed things others overlooked. James and John, brothers as well, were known for their intensity, their ambition, and their fire. These were not perfect men. They were ordinary, flawed, and fully human. On one ordinary day, as they stood by the water, something unexpected happened. Jesus approached them, not as a stranger lost in the crowd, but with intention. There was no grand announcement, no dramatic display, just a simple moment that would change everything. He looked at them, not just at what they were doing, but at who they were. And then he spoke words that seemed both simple and impossible at the same time. "Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." It was a statement that carried weight far beyond its simplicity. These men understood fishing. They knew the patience it required, the skill, the endurance. But this was something different. Fishers of men. What did that even mean? How do you leave something you understand completely for something you cannot even explain? There was a pause in that moment, whether brief or long, no one can truly say. But within that pause was a decision. Around them was everything they had ever known. Their boats, their nets, their routine, their security. In front of them was uncertainty, risk, and a calling that didn't come with guarantees. And yet, something about Jesus made it impossible to ignore. It wasn't just his words. It was his presence, his authority, the way he spoke as if he knew them beyond what they showed on the surface. It was as if he saw potential where others saw limitation, purpose where others saw routine. Peter, Andrew, James, and John made a choice that, on the surface, didn't make sense. They left their nets. They stepped away from their boats. They walked away from everything that defined their lives up to that point. No long negotiations, no detailed plan, no clear roadmap, just a decision to follow. This moment was not just about leaving something behind. It was about stepping into something greater, even if they didn't fully understand it yet. Their identity was beginning to shift. They were no longer just fishermen. They were becoming something new. The phrase, "fishers of men," carried a deeper meaning that would unfold over time. Just as they once cast nets into the sea, they would now reach people, drawing them into something life-changing. It wasn't about control or force, but about influence, connection, and transformation. What makes this moment even more powerful is how ordinary it was. There were no witnesses applauding, no recognition from society, no immediate reward. Just a quiet decision made on the edge of the water. And yet, that quiet decision would echo through history. These men didn't have all the answers. They didn't fully understand who Jesus was or what the future would hold. They would struggle, doubt, fail, and grow. But in that moment, they said yes. And that yes became the beginning of a journey that would reshape not only their lives, but the world itself. What started as a simple call on an ordinary day became the foundation of something extraordinary. And it all began with a willingness to leave the familiar behind and follow a voice that called them into the unknown. But the story does not end with that first decision. In many ways, it was only the beginning of a deeper internal conflict. Following Jesus meant more than walking behind him. It meant letting go of control, of certainty, of the life they had carefully built. Imagine the thoughts running through their minds as they took those first steps away from the shore. Questions without answers, fears without reassurance, and yet a strange sense of direction they could not explain. Peter, especially, would feel this tension strongly. His personality was bold, but even boldness can hide uncertainty. He was leaving behind not just a job, but a role, a responsibility, and a sense of identity. Fishing was not just what he did, it was who he was. The same was true for the others. Their skills, their routines, their relationships, all tied to the life they were now stepping away from, and still they followed. There is something deeply human about that moment. It reveals that transformation, though, among all the people Jesus chose, one stood out in a way that made others uncomfortable, even angry. His name was Matthew, and unlike the fishermen, his profession did not earn quiet respect or sympathy. It earned hatred. Matthew was a tax collector, a man who worked for the Roman Empire, collecting money from his own people. But it wasn't just the job itself that made him despised. Tax collectors were known for taking more than required, enriching themselves at the expense of others. To many, Matthew was not just a traitor. He was a symbol of everything that was wrong with their society. Imagine the tension surrounding someone like him. While others struggled under the weight of heavy taxes, men like Matthew seemed to benefit from that very system. He would have been seen sitting at his tax booth, collecting payments, hearing the frustration in people's voices, yet remaining part of the system they resented. Over time, that kind of life creates distance, not just socially, but emotionally. People stop seeing you as one of them. You become isolated, defined by your choices, judged without mercy. This is where the story takes an unexpected turn. One day, as Matthew sat at his tax booth, doing what he had likely done countless times before, Jesus approached him. There was no debate, no confrontation, no long speech about repentance or change. Just a simple invitation, direct and powerful. Follow me. For anyone watching, it would have been shocking. Of all the people Jesus could have chosen, why him? Why someone so deeply disliked, someone considered corrupt and unworthy? It went against every expectation. Religious leaders would have avoided him. Society had already labeled him. And yet, Jesus saw something different. What happened next is just as surprising. Matthew didn't argue. He didn't hesitate. He got up and followed. That single action carries weight. Matthew had everything many people chase: financial stability, a position of control, and a life that, while disliked, was secure. Walking away from that meant losing not just income, but status within the Roman system. It meant stepping into uncertainty, into a life that offered no guarantees. And yet, he chose to leave it all behind. Why? There is something powerful about being seen differently than how the world defines you. For Matthew, perhaps this was the first time someone looked at him without judgment, without resentment, without seeing only his past. Jesus didn't ignore who Matthew was, but he didn't reduce him to it either. He saw beyond the label of tax collector and recognized something deeper, something worth calling forward. The reaction from others came quickly. When Jesus later sat at a meal with Matthew and other tax collectors, it stirred criticism, especially from religious leaders. They questioned how someone claiming to represent God could associate with people like that. To them, it didn't make sense. Holiness, in their view, meant separation from those considered sinful. But Jesus responded in a way that revealed his purpose. He made it clear that his mission was not to call those who already believed they were righteous, but those who knew they needed change. It wasn't about maintaining appearances. It was about transformation. Matthew's story highlights something essential about the way Jesus chose his disciples. It wasn't about reputation. It wasn't about public approval. In fact, choosing someone like Matthew risked damaging credibility in the eyes of others. But Jesus was not building a group based on how they looked to society. He was building something deeper, something that challenged the very idea of who is worthy. For Matthew, this moment marked the beginning of a complete shift in identity. The man once known for collecting from others would become someone who gave his life to a greater purpose. The one who was rejected would become part of a movement that welcomed others. His past did not disqualify him. Instead, it became part of a story that showed what change can look like. This choice also sent a message to everyone watching. If someone like Matthew could be chosen, then the definition of who belongs was changing. The barriers people had built between clean and unclean, accepted and rejected, were no longer as solid as they seemed. And that made people uncomfortable, because it meant that the system they trusted, the categories they relied on, were being challenged. It meant that grace could reach places they thought it shouldn't. And it meant that being chosen was not about being perfect, but about being willing. Matthew's calling was not just surprising, it was disruptive. It forced people to rethink everything they believed about worth, acceptance, and purpose. And it made one thing clear: Jesus was not choosing disciples based on who they had been. He was choosing them based on who they could become. As the group around Jesus began to grow, it became clear that this was no ordinary gathering of people. It was not built on similarity, shared background, or common perspective. In fact, it was the opposite. The disciples were a mix of personalities, beliefs, and life experiences that, under normal circumstances, would never have coexisted peacefully, and yet somehow they were being brought together. Among them was Simon the Zealot, a man whose identity was shaped by intense political passion. Zealots were not just thinkers or dreamers. They were activists deeply committed to the idea of overthrowing Roman rule. Many were willing to use force to achieve that goal. For someone like Simon, the Roman Empire was not just an inconvenience. It was an enemy that needed to be removed. His worldview was built on resistance, on action, on the belief that change must be fought for. Now place him in the same group as Matthew, the former tax collector who had worked for that very system. Under normal circumstances, these two men would have been on opposite sides of a deep and dangerous divide, one representing resistance against Rome, the other having benefited from its authority. The tension between them would not have been small. It would have been personal, ideological, and emotional, and yet both were called by the same person into the same mission. This alone says something powerful about the nature of what Jesus was building. Then there was Thomas, often remembered for his doubt. But doubt is rarely about weakness. It is about questioning, about needing to understand, about refusing to accept something blindly. Thomas represents a different kind of struggle, the internal one. While others may have followed with quick trust, Thomas needed clarity. He needed to see, to touch, to be sure. His presence in the group shows that faith does not always begin with certainty. Sometimes it begins with questions. There were also others whose stories are less detailed. Men like Philip, Bartholomew, and Thaddeus. They did not stand out in dramatic ways, at least not in the way history records them, and yet they were there, present, chosen. Their inclusion speaks just as loudly as the others. Not everyone in the group needed to be bold, outspoken, or clearly defined. Some were simply willing, and that willingness was enough. This created a dynamic that was anything but simple. You had strong personalities, quiet thinkers, passionate activists, and uncertain followers all walking the same path. Disagreements would have been inevitable. Misunderstandings, moments of tension, even frustration with one another. These were not unlikely. They were expected. And yet they stayed. What held them together was not their similarities, but the one they followed. Jesus became the center that allowed such different individuals to exist within the same purpose. He did not erase their differences. He did not force them into identical roles. Instead, he redirected their focus. For Simon the Zealot, that meant learning that the change he longed for would not come through violence, but through transformation. For Matthew, it meant leaving behind a life tied to power and control, and embracing something built on humility and purpose. For Thomas, it meant discovering that doubt could lead to deeper understanding rather than distance. Each of them was being shaped, not by losing who they were, but by becoming something more. This is what made the group so radical. It wasn't just who they were individually, but who they were together. In a world that was divided by class, belief, and status, this group represented something entirely different. It showed that unity was possible, not because differences disappeared, but because purpose became greater than those differences. There is also something deeply relatable in this. These were not people who had everything figured out. They were learning as they went, growing through experience, making mistakes, and adjusting along the way. Their journey was not smooth or perfect. It was real. And that is what makes their story so powerful, because it reflects something true about transformation. It does not happen in isolation. It happens in relationship, in tension, in moments where different perspectives challenge and refine one another. This group of disciples became more than just followers. They became a reflection of what it looks like when people from completely different walks of life are brought together for something greater than themselves. What Jesus was building was not just a team, it was a living example of change, a group that showed that purpose can unite where everything else divides, a group that proved that even the most unlikely combinations of people can become something meaningful when they are willing to follow the same direction. And as this group continued to grow, one thing became increasingly clear. The power of their story was not in how perfect they were, but in, by this point, a pattern begins to emerge, but it is not the kind people expected. When you look at the men Jesus chose, there is no clear sign of status, influence, or exceptional achievement. They were not religious elites, not political leaders, not individuals who had spent years preparing for something great. In fact, if anything, they seemed like the least likely candidates to be part of something that would change the world. And that is exactly what makes their selection so meaningful, because the question is not just who they were, but why them. If the goal was impact, there were easier choices. There were scholars who understood the law in detail, leaders who already had influence over large groups of people, individuals with education, structure, and authority. Choosing them would have made sense. It would have created a smoother path, a more predictable outcome. And yet, Jesus consistently moved in a different direction. This suggests that the criteria for being chosen had nothing to do with outward qualification. It was not about what people had already achieved. It was about what they were capable of becoming. There is something powerful in that idea. It shifts the focus from performance to potential, from perfection to transformation. The men Jesus chose were not finished products. They were in process. They had weaknesses, blind spots, fears, and failures that would become visible over time. Peter would struggle with fear. Thomas would wrestle with doubt. Others would misunderstand, argue, and even run away in critical moments. And still, they were chosen. This reveals something deeper about the nature of the calling itself. It was not an invitation based on worthiness, but on willingness. A willingness to follow, to learn, to be shaped. The process mattered more than the starting point. It also reveals something about how change actually happens. True transformation does not begin with people who already have everything together. It begins with people who are open to growth, people who are willing to be challenged, corrected, and stretched beyond their comfort. When Jesus looked at these men, he was not seeing them only as they were in that moment. He was seeing what they could become through the journey ahead. He saw leaders where others saw laborers. He saw courage where others saw inconsistency. He saw purpose where others saw ordinary lives. This perspective is what allowed him to build something different. Instead of choosing those who already fit the expected mold, he chose those who would be reshaped entirely. This meant the process would not be easy. It would involve tension, learning, failure, and growth. But it also meant the result would be something authentic, something real. There is also a deeper message hidden within this pattern. It challenges the way people define value. In most systems, worth is measured by achievement, status, or recognition. But here, worth is not the starting requirement. It is something that is revealed and developed over time. This is why the group of disciples becomes so significant. They represent a shift in how purpose is understood. It is no longer reserved for a select few who meet certain standards. It becomes accessible to those who are willing to step forward, even if they feel unprepared. And that changes everything, because it means that the story is not just about them. It is about a principle that extends beyond their time. The idea that ordinary people, with all their imperfections, can be part of something meaningful if they are willing to respond to a calling greater than themselves. This is the hidden pattern. Not power, not perfection, not status, but transformation. And transformation requires trust. It requires stepping into something without having full clarity. It requires letting go of the need to be fully ready before beginning. The disciples did not have a complete understanding of what they were stepping into, but they moved forward anyway. Over time, that decision would shape them in ways they could not have predicted. Their weaknesses would become areas of growth. Their fears would be confronted. Their understanding would deepen, and their influence would extend far beyond their original circumstances. This is what makes their story enduring. It is not just about what they did, but about what they became. And at the center of it all is a simple but powerful truth. Being chosen was never about being the best. It was about being willing to become something more. This is why their story continues to resonate. It reflects a reality that many people recognize in themselves. The feeling of being ordinary, of being uncertain, of not fully knowing if they are enough. And yet, within that uncertainty, there is still the possibility of purpose. The possibility that growth can begin exactly where they are, not where they think they need to be. Following Jesus was never presented as something easy, and for the disciples, that reality became clearer with every step they took. The moment they chose to follow him, they stepped away from more than just their jobs. They stepped away from stability, from predictability, from the kind of life where tomorrow looked similar to today. What they entered instead was uncertain, demanding, and often uncomfortable. For fishermen like Peter, Andrew, James, and John, leaving their nets meant leaving behind their primary source of income. Fishing was not just a job, it was a way of life passed down through generations. It was tied to family, to identity, to survival. Walking away from it was not a small decision. It meant trusting that whatever came next would somehow be enough, even when there was no clear guarantee of provision. For Matthew, the cost looked different, but was just as real. He walked away from financial security and a structured position within the Roman system. While his work had made him unpopular, it had also given him a level of control and comfort. Choosing to follow Jesus meant giving up that security for a life that offered no clear structure, no fixed income, and no predictable outcome. But the cost went beyond what they left behind physically. It also affected their relationships. Family expectations would have been strong. In a culture where roles and responsibilities were deeply rooted, stepping away from those expectations could create tension, confusion, and even disappointment. Explaining their decision would not have been easy. How do you tell your family that you are leaving everything to follow someone who offers no clear plan? There was also the social cost. Aligning themselves with Jesus meant associating with someone who was already beginning to challenge established systems. As his message spread, so did opposition. Religious leaders questioned him. Authorities watched him, and anyone close to him would naturally be drawn into that tension. The disciples were not just observers, they were participants. This meant they would experience rejection, criticism, and misunderstanding. People would question their choices, some would dismiss them, others would oppose them directly. Following Jesus meant stepping into a path where approval was not guaranteed, and where standing out could come with consequences. There were also internal struggles that came with this journey. Doubt, fear, and uncertainty did not disappear the moment they chose to follow. If anything, those feelings likely grew stronger at times. There would be moments when things did not make sense, when expectations were challenged, when outcomes were unclear. Imagine walking forward without knowing where the path leads, trusting someone fully while still trying to understand what is happening around you. That kind of trust is not passive, it is active, tested, and often stretched. And yet, they continued. What kept them moving forward was not comfort or clarity, but conviction. Something about Jesus, his words, his actions, his presence, created a sense of purpose that outweighed the cost. It did not remove the difficulty, but it gave it meaning. This is an important part of their story. The cost of following was real and it was significant, but it was not without direction. Every step they took, every sacrifice they made, was shaping them into something different. They were learning to rely on something beyond their own control. They were learning to let go of certainty and embrace trust. They were learning that purpose often requires sacrifice, and this idea challenges a common assumption. Many people look for paths that offer both purpose and comfort at the same time. But the journey of the disciples shows that growth often comes through difficulty, that stepping into something meaningful may require leaving something familiar behind. This does not make the journey easy. It makes it real, because the cost is what gives the decision weight. It is what turns a simple choice into a defining moment. Without cost, there is no true commitment. For the disciples, following Jesus was not just a moment, it was a continuous decision. One they would have to reaffirm again and again, especially when things became difficult. And as the journey continued, the cost would only increase. But so would the depth of their transformation. What they gave up was significant, but what they were becoming would prove to be far greater. At the beginning, they were ordinary men, defined by their routines, their limitations, and the expectations placed on them by society. Fishermen, a tax collector, a zealot, men with no formal influence or recognized authority. If anyone had looked at them in those early moments, nothing about their lives would have suggested that they were about to become part of something that would shape history. But transformation does not happen all at once. It happens gradually, through experience, through challenge, through moments that test and refine a person over time. As they continued to walk with Jesus, something began to change within them. The same men who once questioned and doubted began to speak with growing clarity. The ones who were uncertain started to show courage. They were no longer just observing, they were becoming participants in something far greater than themselves. Peter, once impulsive and inconsistent, would grow into a voice of boldness. Thomas, who needed proof, would move toward deeper conviction. Matthew, once defined by his past, would become part of a message that reached far beyond it. Each of them was being reshaped, not into someone else, but into a fuller version of who they were meant to be. This transformation was not based on perfection. They still made mistakes, they still struggled, but they were changing. And that is what made their impact so powerful, because when their journey continued beyond Jesus' time with them, they did not return to who they had been. They carried forward what they had learned, what they had experienced, and what they had become. Their lives became evidence that ordinary people, when shaped by purpose, can create extraordinary change. What began as a simple decision to follow had now become something far greater. They were no longer just disciples, they were messengers, leaders, and witnesses to something that would continue long after them, and through their transformation, the world would never be the same again. It began with a simple question: why would someone choose the least qualified to change the world? By now, the answer is clear. Jesus did not choose based on status, knowledge, or perfection. He chose based on something deeper, potential, willingness, and the ability to be transformed. The fisherman, the tax collector, the zealot, and the doubter were never the obvious choices. They were ordinary, flawed, and uncertain. But that was exactly the point. Their story shows that greatness is not found in where you start, but in what you are willing to become. They left behind security, faced uncertainty, struggled with doubt, and walked a path that demanded everything from them. And yet, through that journey, they were changed. Not instantly, not perfectly, but steadily. And that transformation is what gave their lives meaning and impact. In the end, the story is not just about them. It is a reminder that purpose is not reserved for the perfect. It is available to those willing to step forward, even when they feel unready. So the real question is no longer why they were chosen. The real question is, what happens when you choose to respond? If this story challenged the way you think, make sure you like this video and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories like this.